From a distance, East Timor looks like an idyllic tropical island. It's difficult to come to terms with the facts that in this small island so much pain, death and horror have taken place, that the people of this tiny country on Australia's doorstep have found the road to freedom goes right through hell. In September 1999, East Timor was torched and destroyed. The extent of this destructive violence has been seen rarely before. The destruction came as an aftermath of a referendum in which the people of East Timor voted overwhelmingly in favour of independence from Indonesia.
The people of East Timor have thus rejected the proposed special autonomy and expressed their wish to begin a process of transition towards independence.
In the face of world pressure, a multinational force was put together in Australia in readiness to bring stability to East Timor. Before this force could move, the world waited for an invitation from then Indonesian President Habibie. And while the world waited, East Timor burned.
It looked like it was a desperate situation here, and one in which people were being hurt. So we, at that stage, could see, I guess, the gathering storm clouds that a military mission would be needed. And we were furiously planning in case it was authorised.
Major General Peter Cosgrove was the Australian soldier put in command of the Interfet forces.
Well, we'd been conducting some fairly detailed planning to respond to the accelerating pace of events here in East Timor and in New York. We'd been doing that planning for some weeks before actually getting the order to go. So it's all somewhat of a blur, but my best recollection is that it started to look very likely that we'd have to execute some kind of an operation late in August, when it became obvious that there was some significant violence taking place.
What about East Timor? Young innocent people are dead!
Public pressure built to unprecedented levels on Prime Minister John Howard. Howard was torn between the public pressure to act and the opposing pressure from his diplomatic advisers, who didn't want to see a quarter of a century of diplomatic relation building with Indonesia go down the drain. A relationship that promised stability in the region. But there was no stability in East Timor. Howard gave the word and General Peter Cosgrove mobilised his troops.
The force that we sent here was propelled out of barracks at very great velocity, through Darwin in some cases, or in some other cases direct from Laverack barracks in Townsville, and arrived here in fighting order in a remarkably quick time. So many years of investment and training paid off.
Interfet landed in East Timor, and this is the story of that 5-month period. But what led to this destruction that appalled the world? It's probably something we'll never understand, like the Holocaust in Germany in the Second World War. But to try and get a picture of the East Timor dilemma, it helps to put the country in an historical context. The island of Timor lies about 600 kilometres northwest of Darwin. It has traditionally been populated by indigenous people whose community structure was divided into many different language groups and kingdoms. The Portuguese made East Timor a colony in the 1500s. East Timor was the poorest colony of the poorest European colonial power. Portugal couldn't afford to do much with the island other than, with labour press gangs of Timorese people, build many forts throughout the colony that today express the siege mentality of the Portuguese for the 4 centuries they held the colony. Without an army, the Portuguese administrators developed a governing style of intrigue, playing one kingdom off against another, ensuring no tall poppies grew that could be a threat to Portuguese rule. Portuguese occupation was uncomfortable at best. More than 100,000 East Timorese were killed in the aftermath of an attempted uprising at the end of the 19th and the early years of the 20th centuries. During the Second World War, the Japanese slaughtered more than 60,000 Timorese after they helped a small group of 400 Australian commandos keep a huge Japanese force of 20,000 at bay. in an action some say stopped the land invasion of northern Australia. In 1974, the fascist government of Portugal was overthrown and Portuguese colonies set free without any real support. This led to a short civil war between a conservative movement of the old power and the new vibrant People's Party that would become Fretilin, and later today's CNRT. However, Indonesia didn't want any party that could be construed as socialist on its doorstep. The Indonesian military killed 5 Australian journalists in and around this house in Balibo, and Australia did nothing.
Had Australia objected and done the right thing there, probably the invasion of East Timor wouldn't have taken place, but the Indonesian troops pulled out, but we haven't to this day objected or complained about that or apologised to Shirley Shackleton and the other family. That was an opportunity lost.
Rob Wesley Smith has been actively campaigning for a free East Timor since the Indonesian invasion in 1975. He believes that Australia's attitude towards the Indonesian invasion was close to an invitation. Having tested the waters by many incursions and murders, even of foreign journalists, Indonesia moved. On December the 7th, 1975, Indonesian warships shelled the unfortified city of Dili. At daylight, thousands of paratroopers were dropped. Civilian Timorese men, women and children were shot in the streets.
They are very self-sufficient, self-reliant people with a lot of stoicness about them, I think, and they just resisted as best they could. But at that stage it was primarily a land war, keep the Indonesians out of areas, but if they attacked in enough force to take a town, then the resistance lines would move back.
Indonesian Foreign Minister Adam Malik quoted the number of between 60 and 80,000 Timorese killed in the first couple of months of the invasion. 60 or 80,000, he said. What does it really matter? "600 kilometres away, big, fat, comfortable Australia slept, choosing to believe its government's media releases, not listening to the small group of activists and Timorese refugees that fought relentlessly for the ear of Middle Australia for 25 years.
Campaign for Independent East Timor here. Are you there? Please answer.
In the period following the invasion, Rob Wesley Smith and other Darwin activists maintained an illegal radio link with East Timor, the only contact the rebels had with the outside world.
When we planned to do a broadcast to Timor, we would meet at a given hour, but we wouldn't decide where we were going until we drove down the road, checking to see if we were being followed. Then we would head to an area, look for a situation where we could throw the antenna up into a tree, not have too much interference in front of that, and preferably look for access that two ways. One, we could see the road coming in, but we could have a road to sneak out, and in the final analysis, wear running shoes to run with the radio if we got caught red-handed. And we'd be listening in, and quite often you would hear the static of the radio being warmed up in East Timor, and off we'd go.
The Australian government continually tried to catch the Northern Territory activists while transmitting, and had 3 receivers working in the bush to establish the outlaw transmitter by triangulation.
Why they thought it was important to isolate the people of East Timor is just beyond me. It's one of these questions I keep asking. This nation was totally isolated from the world except for this radio, being invaded by Indonesia. They'd killed 100,000 people, and this radio was their only means of communication, only way of telling the outside world.
While Western politicians hoped it would be a fast piece of military surgery, the invasion and following internal war stretched on for the 25 years of Indonesian occupancy.
The Indonesians bombed the fields and the homes and so on, forced people into starvation. You can still see areas where napalm on rocky areas, nothing grows. And they used weaponry supplied by Jimmy Carter's government, United States, that was stuff which the resistance couldn't handle, these Bronco OV-10 aircraft dropping napalm and so on, flying out of range of the rifles.
The resistance force within Timor was Fretilin. A young commander grew up in its ranks, a young man who would eventually lead the country.
Several years, really, for Shenana Gusmao to be the leader of the resistance, for the concept of guerrilla war to really be the strong force. And at that time, Shenana moved around the refugee camps, the prison camps, and and asked old people, many of whom were destined to be subsequently murdered because Indonesia took their revenge for the next couple of years, should he keep the fight going. And
East Timor was a closed country until 1989, when it was open to visitors. The East Timorese started an action of demonstrations at a high cost, the most famous of which was what was to become known as the Dili Massacre at Santa Cruz Cemetery in 1991.
Dili Massacre 91, a very major event, and only because it was filmed, you know. Max Stahl was there. We've seen now go past the Santa Cruz Cemetery, went there for the anniversary, and actually when you look at it, the distance between where he was and the gate is so much smaller than it appears from the film. I mean, he must have been right in the firing line there, and he kept the camera going. So
250 people died on that day in this cemetery. Their deaths became a rally cry for renewed activism around the world. By the mid-90s, Indonesia was describing East Timor as a piece of sharp gravel in its shoe. While Indonesia put far more development, roads, bridges, communications into East Timor than the Portuguese ever did, they could not control the resistance.
I've heard it said it's only a small half island of 800,000 people at most. It is vital to the future of human rights, human values, humanity itself, that the people of East Timor are at the top of our agenda.
Pressure finally brought about a UN-sponsored vote, so the East Timorese people could decide for themselves whether they wanted to continue with Indonesia or for independence. The referendum vote was finally scheduled for August 1999.
There's 94,388 in favour and 340...
The people voted overwhelmingly for independence, and this unleashed the terrifying wave of violence over East Timor by the Indonesian army-supported militias.
After the results of the referendum were announced, our days of orchestration of a situation that meant that the UN presence gradually was removed from certain areas because of security. That should not have happened given the military presence of a government there. That government was complicit. And I have to say that. That is what I have heard, that's what I believe.
In spite of their promises, the United Nations was at a loss to protect the people they had urged to vote. The number of people who died will probably never be known, but conservative figures place a death toll over the period of Indonesian rule in excess of 250,000 people, out of a population of around 800,000. On September the 20th, 1999, General Peter Cosgrove and Interfet moved on East Timor. Troops were landed with Hercules and the high-speed catamaran HMAS Jarbas Bay.
My intent was to make sure that we put a sufficiently large and capable force ashore very quickly in order to demonstrate to all those people who'd been perpetrating these great acts of violence that a large military force was present. It was fair dinkum, and the time for all that violence and arson and robbery was over. So that was the initial thing, to get powerful forces ashore very quickly, which we did.
Stepped on the ground, everything was on fire as we approached, and didn't really know what to expect exactly. People everywhere, and it was just trash, really. We came in and was shocked to see. I'd heard it was all destroyed, and then to actually see it was just something that I'd never expected. So it was just, the whole country was just flattened. Like, not a single house escaped anything.
Just the devastation of all the burnt buildings, and yeah, it was pretty frightening really. Like, we were all in the loaded condition, had Kevlar helmet on, and being the first deployment I'd ever been on, and I hadn't even been in the Air Force 12 months. Yeah, it was a pretty frightening experience. I think I'll remember it. Not that, you know, you thought you were going to get shot or anything. It's just all the burnt buildings. Just, it was like going through a ghost town.
I was amazed at the amount of destruction. The short time that it all occurred was really amazing that the people could do that to themselves. You know, it's just unbelievable.
Well, we came through when landed on Jarvis Bay, a bit apprehensive, not knowing exactly what to expect. But I think our first impression walking through the gates into the town was the devastation. Everything was burnt. People were all cheering us on, like I suppose the saviours come over, I suppose. They were quite happy we were here. Everything was destroyed, everything was burnt. We didn't know who was friendly and who wasn't. Everyone looked the same to us at the time.
It was like being in a movie, you know, where you've seen an atom bomb drop and nothing's left, and it was just one of devastation.
In the latter half of September, the situation was explosive in the extreme. If Interfet showed weakness, it would surely fail. If it didn't stick to disciplined restraint, there would undoubtedly be a bloodbath as the Interfet forces faced off the Indonesian army.
From what we'd heard, the Indonesians were out to cause us a lot of trouble, save their own face, things like that. We weren't quite sure what to expect from them. Always a bit dubious in their presence around the areas. From looking at the devastation of the area and what they'd done to their own people, I wasn't quite sure of what they'd be capable of doing to us. And we were told that the militia were getting support, or at least the Indonesian forces weren't trying to stop them. So we weren't quite sure of how much support they'd give, what our relationship to the Indonesians was like, and anyone we saw with any kind of weapon, a machete or a pipe gun, we didn't know if they were friendly or enemy or what they were trying to do.
The 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment is Interfet's longest-serving combat unit. Under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Peter Singh, these soldiers helped secure Dili, secured the border region around Maliana, and secured the Okusi enclave.
The biggest challenge for me was keeping the battalion vigilant and aggressively patrolling the border down in the Okusi enclave, and also keeping the men resupplied in remote mountain regions. When an infantryman goes out on a patrol, he doesn't know where the harm is going to be around the next corner on the road, in the next copse of trees or whatever. So he has to be constantly vigilant and alert to danger that can spring almost from anywhere. And month after month they had to keep that vigilance going and keep, if you like, their alertness to the highest level. The soldiers had really a main job to protect the East Timorese people, and while they were doing that job, they were living very closely with those people in villages and towns and so forth. It was only natural that they started to give humanitarian aid, and that's how they won the trust of the people. And that helped us with our security work as well, because then the local people saw us as being friends, and they would provide us with information about the militia and so forth.
Interfet started the process of securing East Timor region by region. General Peter Cosgrove took a precautionary approach.
And then to start to spread our influence geographically through East Timor, starting with Dili, because Dili is very important, and then expanding out to the other areas, particularly the western regencies down near the border of East and West Timor, where the militia had long been claiming they were going to partition that part of the country. So that was the basic plan, and we kept rolling the forces in, particularly through Dili, through the port and the airfield, on virtually a non-stop air bridge, and using sea transport through the port, building up combat units and logistic units. And that was non-stop, and that took place for weeks and weeks just with the Australians, and then of course we started to add on the overseas contingents. And it seemed to be in a remarkably quick time, we built up from that couple of thousand ashore in the first 24 hours up to a peak where this force was 11,500. But that counts our Navy and Air Force parts of the force. But up to 11,500 at the peak.
Media was involved with the operation from the outset, sometimes drawing criticism because journalists and camera operators on a couple of occasions were given priority over aid workers. But tragedy struck in early October when a Dutch journalist tried to get the edge on his colleagues and pay the ultimate price. He was killed by members of the militia. This brought home the reality of the situation to many journalists. This was for real. In securing Dili, Australian soldiers had to sort out just who were militia and who were ordinary citizens. Chances couldn't be taken, and all was recorded for the world to see. While Interfet secured Dili, the terrible status of much of the population became obvious. Tens of thousands of people were without food, without shelter, with very few clothes. Humanitarian aid started to flow, but wrecked roads and militia presence made it very difficult to get aid out into the regions where it was needed. The United Nations set up a commission of inquiry to look into the atrocities that had been carried out.
Militia?
Militia from Jakarta, from Timor.
Were they killed because they were independent?
Because they are a leader people for resistance in freedom East Timor.
In November, Sonia Picardo of the Commission, UNCIET, arrived in Dili and with the Commission travelled throughout East Timor gathering information for the report. And in mid-November, the women of East Timor gathered and marched. The price paid by the women of this country was huge, enormous numbers raped and killed. The marchers remembered their sisters and visited infamous places of mass rape and death. The anger, the tragedy, the hurt stood aflame in the hearts of these women who survived. By early December, Peter Cosgrove had delivered a high degree of stability to East Timor. In celebration of this stability, permission was given to have a concert in Dili. This would be the largest group of people gathered in one place since the crisis. For Interfet, it was a chance to show the tangible results of Operation Stabilise. So Interfet arranged transport and support for 30 Darwin musicians.
Real coordinator here in Dili and a great musician himself.
Many of these musicians had fought for the free East Timor cause in Australia for many years. The concert was a chance to bring all those years of activism to a focal point and meet face to face with the people they'd been fighting for, through the universal language of music. Christmas was a sad and lonely time for Interfet personnel, many of whom had their first Christmas away from family. The millennium changed, and through the benefit of satellite technology, East Timor joined the world in the live global broadcast. Direct television contact with the lounge rooms of the world, so far from when the only contact with the outside world was with one illegal HF radio in Northern Australia.
We'd like to say special thank you to everyone. Make East Timor free. Thank you. Viva Timor-Leste!
The humanitarian effort was proceeding, challenged by poor conditions, the wet season that makes access to remote areas difficult, many workers from temperate climates who find the tropical conditions difficult, and there are accusations of bureaucratic bungling.
Maybe things are not going as well as everybody or the majority of the East Timorese people, even including us, expected. The situation is not easy. I cannot speak for other NGOs, I can only speak for myself. We try as hard as we can to deliver the best. If it's not perfect, bad luck, but we try our best, and I think that's the most important thing. We've been here in East Timor before, since January 99. And so far as any other NGO, we are all into emergency activities, such as building shelters, repairing roads, mainly in 3 districts in Kovalima, Same and Ainaro, run our clinics in Barupite, Pekora and Dili, and then 1 clinic in Batugade.
Sao Federer says the emergency period will go on for another 6 to 12 months. There is still great need for the basics in remote regions.
The main needs are still clothing and shelter. People do not have jobs. I think 90% of the population is unemployed. There is no money here to circulate around. People cannot buy. If you don't have a job, how can you buy, even the soap you need? So the basic items, for the basic necessities, I think it should be still provided. Those who can afford to give, we will be grateful to continue to receive, as we have been so far. People come and ask for all sorts of things, clothing, shoes, every basic necessity, soap. We have provided that, but in areas where we operate in, we don't have enough to provide to all the people. So we try to send bits and little bits and pieces here. Besides the areas where we are operating, the areas I have already mentioned, we have local organizations, the parish priests, the nuns, from all over Timor, collecting, 6 boxes of this and 3 bags of that and 4. So we try to reach in the best way we can. Of course, it's never enough.
By February, the end of Interfet control was growing close. Major General Peter Cosgrove had done his job. The forces, including several thousand Australians, would come under the command of the United Nations Transitional Administration in East Timor, UNTAET. The Aussie rag hats would be changed for blue berets, but that is yet to come. The Secretary-General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, would first visit East Timor, a visit calculated to reassure the East Timorese people of the ongoing support of the UN, and to give Kofi Annan a first-hand experience of conditions on the ground. The jet carrying the Secretary-General lands in Dili. He's met by Peter Cosgrove, Janana Kuzmau and the other heads of interim power. He's whisked away almost immediately to what was planned to be a small celebration in the town of Likasar, where a particularly tragic massacre took place. His helicopter lands in a field some kilometres out of Likasar. A group of people gather, unplanned, to see what was going on. Kofi Annan breaks the planned itinerary and with his wife Nani walks over to speak with them. An old man throws himself in Kofi Annan's arms, unprompted. The Secretary-General, who has undoubtedly seen the worst the world has to offer, is moved by the sheer emotion of the situation. The party visits the place a convoy of refugees was attacked by militia and several people killed. Kofi Annan walks through the streets of Likasar. The crowd has grown to thousands upon thousands. The emotion lives. You can touch the joy and the thanks of these people who a few short months ago were frightened to walk on their own streets. In the Likasar church, a wreath is laid to remember the 75 people massacred here in the churchyard in September. Memories of lost loved ones is still fresh. Children without parents, without brothers or sisters. And in the local football field, Kofi Annan tells these people that the family of nations will never again forget East Timor.
By the violence of the
10,000 people have turned out in front of United Nations headquarters to see and hear the Secretary-General. Placards call for justice, but the people are happy.
But your cries of agony were heard around the world. I know it seemed like a very long time before help arrived, but an international force did come to East Timor to restore order. Now the United Nations is here to help you rebuild.
Viva Secretário-Geral Kofi Annan! Fight inimigo batida! Viva Jean Marker, inimigo batida!
This is the day of transfer from Interfet to the United Nations up here in the mountains, and the lone piper heralds the new day. Balabo is a place of history and tragedy. A 400-year-old Portuguese fort is the headquarters for the 5th 7th Battalion Mechanised. It was in this small mountain town that the 5 Australian journalists were killed all those years ago. It's a place of history. Local people gather in the plaza. In the faces of the East Timorese people, hope for the future.
Today marks the end of Interfet's task in this area. For our part, the 5th 7th Battalion will continue to help all the people of East Timor. Our task will continue to have 3 components. Firstly, security of the border region. Next, maintaining peace throughout the area by contributing to the capabilities of those who are responsible for law and order, that is UN CIVPOL, and also creating public confidence by setting the conditions to allow emergency humanitarian assistance and reconstruction to proceed.
Husia minha parte, Batalhão 5.
The changeover is rolling out. Major General Peter Cosgrove says the Interfet forces have made him proud, particularly how they have handled relations with the East Timorese.
To watch the interaction between Interfet servicemen and women and the East Timorese, it's wonderful. it would really put a smile on your face to watch the affection between all the diggers of the three services and their East Timorese counterparts. It's just great to see the children identifying with our men and women, and it's great to see the great compassion our people have for the East Timorese.
It's difficult to visit East Timor and not be affected by the incredible strength of the human spirit in these people.
You're right, I think they've got the most marvellous courage, the ability to endure, the ability to take a philosophical step forward in life, to say, oh well, you know, we've had really tough times, but life goes on.
The happiness of the people in face of the incredible losses is sometimes hard to understand.
In their eyes, they finally got the freedom that they were waiting for so long, and they said it's just a price they had to pay, and they were quite happy for the fact that they got the freedom and willing to forget anything that had happened in the past. You know?
What has been the cost to the young Australians who are part of Interfet?
Our young men and women have seen some awful sights, have been exposed to very high levels of human suffering, and they are, I guess, sadder and wiser in that respect. But fortunately, I think they'll be rewarded too by the attitude of their fellow Australians when they get home, who will say to all of them of the three services, get on your digger.
From a professional point of view, certainly there's a number of people that I have spoken to that have experienced, I suppose, a degree of not so much trauma, but they've been exposed to sights and experiences which they wouldn't have experienced in other places. And I suppose with some soldiers, especially the younger ones, there was a degree of loss of innocence where they were confronted with situations which I suppose did put into question their personal beliefs and their personal values, and they had to, I suppose, reassess what the world was all about. Overall, the majority of soldiers have done very, very well over here. We have not had too many psychological casualties, as we expected. And I suppose the overwhelming feeling amongst the soldiers that we have been getting, certainly in our interviews, is that all of them are very proud of what they have done over here, and they should be proud because they have done an excellent job.
And of the East Timorese, where to now? The United Nations and the aid organisations are helping to build the new nations to establish government, legal and administrative structures. But what do those who have spent time on the ground think needs to happen to give the East Timorese the true democracy they seek in the future?
I think the issue is really one of allowing time for what is a very major process to bite, to work. I mean, here we're seeing a country that's been burnt to ashes has got to be rebuilt. There's so much work to be done, and the people must yet again show their courage and their patience. They've been so patient and hopeful for 25 years under an unwelcome administration, and now they must be patient while the rebuild takes place and gives them opportunities and work and shelter and a health service and a transport service and all the things that a small independent nation needs to have in order to be viable.
I don't want to be too optimistic. I think the best way to cope with the situation and move forward is to be realistic. Facing the difficulties there are, and they'll be there for a long time. And in my view, it would be 10 years at least for everything is up and running. Instead of sitting around and complaining and shouting and screaming, I think we should grab whatever is available and go forward with this. The problem that the humanitarian groups will face, we have to change. I think gradually we have to start to plan for the long-term development. Instead of emergency, we can provide things, but that people can build themselves, capacity building, rather than giving.
But I will say that the nation of East Timor is at a very early stage of nation building, and it's a very fragile time when a whole lot of national entities have to work together. The security forces, humanitarian aid, and also the building of institutions, legal institutions and government bureaucracies and so forth?
The people have a lot of faith in Xanana Guzman, a lot of faith in him. Most of them are just willing to let him do everything, and they'll be happy with whatever he does because they believe that he's looking after them. They don't. Where we were in Akusi, they had a lot of meetings deciding on language, currency, education, power, agriculture, all that kind of things. But they seem to be looking after it themselves.
East Timor faces many problems. With such a long history of conflict, it will take time to work problems through in a peaceful way. The militia is still active in the border regions, and while there has been a change of government in Jakarta, it could take years for the positive effect to reach the remote regions of West Timor. The positive side is that Indonesia has become a different place since the elections, with new Reform President Abdurrahman Wahid in power and General Oranto and the other drivers of the East Timor Holocaust under investigation.
Timor has ended up being the tail that wagged the dog because the students were there, they interacted with Indonesian students, they taught them a lot about democracy, they've been taught lies for all these years, and there was a really big interaction there.
It's 7 a.m. on the 23rd of February 2000, the last day of the existence of Interfet. Peter Cosgrove attends the lowering of the flag at Interfet headquarters. By mid-morning, the final housekeeping is done. It's time to formalise the handover. The papers are signed that puts the security of East Timor into the hands of the United Nations. As Peter Cosgrove emerges from UN headquarters, local people have gathered in an act of thanks.
Don't forget the Timorese. Yes? We won't forget you. I pray for you. Thank you very much. We'll pray for you.
Viva Xanana Guzman!
Viva!
Viva Jose Ramos Horta!
Viva!
Viva Timor Leste!
Viva!
Viva Interfet!
Viva!
Viva Peter Cosgrove!
Viva!
At the wharf, Peter Cosgrove meets the press for the last time in East Timor as commander of Interfet.
Ladies and gentlemen, 157 days into the operation, Interfet has accomplished its mission and is today dissolved. 22 countries who started here on the 20th of September have been into East Timor and have provided the most urgent, necessary, life-giving assistance to the people of East Timor. Peace and security has largely been restored. The border areas in Akusi and in the west of East Timor remain tense places. However, with the continued vigilance of the United Nations peacekeeping force, I have no doubt that these areas will also remain relatively peaceful and stable and provide a shelter and a shield for the people of East Timor to rebuild their lives.
And I think that they should not forget Timor until, and I hope forever, I hope that in the future the proximity with Australia, particularly with Darwin, will be increased in a sense of good friendship, good understanding, good relationships. You can form sister schools, sister cities, so that the relationship will ongoing, not only because the troops came and they left and things will be finished. So we hope this good continuity of relationship with Australia continue in any form, any shape and size.
the future starts now. Viva Timor Lorasai! Viva Timor Lorasai! Viva!